the Humean views laws as something like maybe observed regularities, patterns, things like that.
Yeah.
And then the non-Humean thinks of them as much more robustly metaphysical, whether it's coming from the outside, God
Sure.
imposing laws on
Sure.
the world, or, as you said, based on the nature of things. Like
Yeah.
strings do what they do because it's just
Kinds
in
of
their
things that they
nature,
are.
if they exist.
Yeah,
If strings exist.
Yeah.
Okay. And where does this connect with consciousness?
Cool. Yeah. So there's this, I guess, tradition that some people label Russellian monism, other people label Ramseyan humility, other people label epistemic structural realism. So there's a lot of labels, but the basic thought is that really science doesn't tell us about what things are like intrinsically. Science only tells us the kinds of causal relationships that things stand in. So if you ask a scientist, what is it to have mass, or what is it to be electrically charged, they'll tell you the sort of role it has in certain mathematical equations. Like if you're electrically charged, you're going to interact with other electrically charged things in such and such ways. And if you're massive, you'll interact with massive things in such and such ways. But science actually doesn't tell us sort of the intrinsic nature of electric charge or mass. They just tell us the sort of functional thing of what it does. And I think there's actually a cool, interesting analogy between consciousness here, because take the experience of pain, let's say. There's a sort of you can draw the similar distinction of that there's a kind of like the causal role of pain, sort of what pain does. And what does pain do? It makes you say ow and avoid it and things like this. But there's also like, you can know all about that sort of functional characterization of what pain makes you do, but you're still missing out on something. You're missing out on like the intrinsic character of what it feels like to be in pain. Something with experience of red, you can know how it interacts with the brain and whatever, but it seems like you're missing out on the intrinsic character of the experience of red. And so, yeah, so a lot of people who, don't have any specific views about consciousness have endorsed this view about physics, that physics only tells us sort of causal structure, and it doesn't tell us the nature of the properties that play these causal roles. And so then there's an interesting question of like, what are these intrinsic natures of the properties that play the causal roles that physics is silent about? And you could just be sort of a Mysterian and say, we'll never know, and we're just sort of blocked from that. But sort of one thing that people have speculated about, like in the literature on the philosophy of mind, is that maybe we should take this analogy pretty seriously. Like in the case of consciousness, there's what consciousness looks like from the outside, how it behaves, but there's also like this internal ingredient that you're missing. Maybe the same thing is happening for physical systems, that there's this, we know what physical systems do from the outside, but there's a sort of an internal thing that we can't publicly observe. And maybe that has something to do with consciousness. So, and people endorse the variations of panpsychism and idealism, which say, the nature of mass or electric charge or the way it functions in the universe is really consciousness, and physics sort of describes it sort of from the outside of how it interacts with other things. And I think this is related to the sort of Humean, non-Humean kind of divide, because earlier I said there's this version of non-Humanism where you explain why things do what they do in terms of their sort of internal nature or something like that. And so if you think that the internal nature of things is associated with consciousness, then that view would be that it's because of things, consciousness properties, that they behave in the way that they do. And I think we have a sort of a glimpse of how this works in the case of our own conscious experience. So like if you experience a horrible pain and then you're motivated to like try to get rid of it or something, there seems like there's like an intelligible connection there between like the horribleness of the pain and why you're inclined to get rid of it. It seems like there's a kind of explanation of like the reason why you try to avoid the pain is because of how it feels. And you might think similar things happen for the microphysical level, but the reason why things do what they do is because they have this kind of conscious internal nature. And yeah, so that's a view, sometimes called the phenomenal powers view, that it's been prominently defended by Hedda Merck, and I myself have defended it in a couple of places, and Harold Langzam has defended it. But I think that's a kind of view that it's a non-Humean view where you have like an explanation for why things do what they do. And I sort of like it because it's sort of, it tries to have certain Humean commitments or be compatible with certain Humean commitments. So it doesn't posit anything extra that the Humean already doesn't believe in. So the Humean already believes in these unknowable intrinsic natures, at least most versions of Humanism do. So David Lewis, the arch-Humean, believed that there were these what he called quiddities that we can't know anything about. And this version of non-humanism doesn't posit any like external governing laws or God to make things happen. So it doesn't posit anything the Humean doesn't. It just has a different view on those sort of things that we can't know about. And it tries to give some kind of explanatory story for how this explanation could go. Like we have a glimpse of it in our own conscious lives. So I think it's a cool connection between consciousness and this kind of non-Humean stuff.
Where specifically do panpsychism and then idealism come in?
Yeah, so there's a question of defining panpsychism and idealism. And I think at least one clear difference is, I mean, obviously people define these things in many different ways, but one definition of panpsychism is just that some fundamental physical types of entities are conscious or something like that. Idealism, I think of as a stronger thesis that something like there's nothing but consciousness at the fundamental level. So the panpsychist it's compatible with panpsychism that there's other stuff in addition to consciousness at the fundamental level. And idealism just says there's nothing but consciousness. So idealism is stronger than panpsychism. And the way it comes in is just via this kind of point about physics only tells us the structural nature of things, not the intrinsic nature of things. And if you think the intrinsic nature of things involves consciousness, and if you have the stronger view that there's nothing else but consciousness, then that would be a kind of idealist picture where what physics is describing is sort of the flux of consciousness sort of from the outside. We see these patterns and mathematicize them. But sort of the underlying explanation for why things behave according to these patterns is because they have the conscious experiences that they do.
And where do you fall in here? Do you label yourself?
So obviously a lot of these things are super speculative, but I guess I'm inclined to just on the first order evidence actually prefer a kind of idealist picture. I've even argued for this even stronger version in another paper of mine.
Is that the one on modal idealism?
Yeah, where I think there's a question. So suppose you buy this view that a lot of people do and who are not really interested in consciousness about there are these intrinsic natures that we don't know of. There's a question of like, what kinds of intrinsic natures could there be? Maybe some involve consciousness, but could there be some other totally different kind of intrinsic nature? And I guess I've tried to argue that actually the only possible intrinsic nature there could be is consciousness. So like idealism is not only just like a contingent truth that happens to be true, but like all possible worlds are idealist worlds, which is a very strong thesis. And obviously, because it's such a strong thesis, not at all super confident in it, but I think there's interesting arguments in favor.
I've never talked about idealism on the show. I have talked about panpsychism a few times. I interviewed Philip Goff, and then it's come up in some conversations with, I think, Dan Dennett and Sean Carroll, and maybe Steven Pinker too. And Sean and Dan are people who are very science-minded, but I think that you're very science-minded too.
Yeah.
So I wonder where it is that you find yourself disagreeing with people like them who point to the success of the NCC or Neural Correlates of Consciousness program and think that, or are convinced that eventually, science purportedly it hasn't reached a stumbling block yet. So why shouldn't we have faith that it will eventually unravel the hard problem, which I think.
Yeah. So actually one of my main reasons for having this kind of view is motivated by this sort of Humean, non-Humean kind of stuff. So I think there's actually just really strong arguments against Humeanism, it seems to me. There's also really strong arguments against a kind of external governing picture. So I think the only view left is some kind of internal non-Humanism. But then there's this question of like, how could we have some explanation for why this internal stuff makes things behave? And I think our sort of only glimpse of how that could be intelligible is our own conscious life. So I think even independently of like the standard arguments in the philosophy of mind, I just think there's arguments from science that we need to explain why things do what they do, and this is the most promising route. But even bracketing all that, there's there's all the standard sort of anti-physicalist arguments that people talk about sort of knowledge argument and the explanatory gap argument and the zombie argument. And I sort of am sympathetic to all those arguments. And it's not clear to me that the sort of, I don't know, neuroscientific work of like correlating certain brain activity to consciousness is a great argument for physicalism. I think any version of anti-physicalism should agree that there's all these correlations. There's just a question about the nature of these correlations. So are those like identifications or are those some other kind of connection? Is there some kind of bridging law? Are these correlations something like what consciousness does from the outside, but there's this sort of internal nature to that causal activity? So yeah, I think I think everyone should agree that obviously if you do stuff to your brain, you change your conscious experience, but it's not at all clear to me that forces anyone to be a physicalist or anything. Yeah, in terms of like, will one day get there? Yeah, I guess for me, the sort of standard anti-physicalist arguments don't seem to be a sort of matter of degree, that we just need to know more complexity about how neurons behave. It seems to be a sort of fundamental difference in kind. And again, there's this motivation just in terms of understanding the laws of nature and a kind of non-Humean thing that isn't touched by these kinds of things. So, I mean, I should say that, all these are obviously super speculative, and I totally think physicalist views are totally respectable. And in some moods, I mean, I sort of am attracted to opposite extremes on this kind of picture. Part of me likes sort of idealism, that it's all consciousness. But part of me likes this kind of radical like illusionism, that actually all this special consciousness stuff, it's just, it's all an illusion. There's just, brain activity in our brain is making us think we have all these special properties. So in some ways, I'm sort of attracted to this, like all consciousness is an illusion. So I'm sort of attracted to opposite extremes, that it's either like everything or nothing. But I still think even if I was an illusionist, I'd have this problem of like, there's this internal nature of things and why do they behave in the way they do? And consciousness helps us with that. And I think there's independent reason to think that, the only possible intrinsic nature is consciousness. So anyway, I should say those views are perfectly respectable.